Good morning. Welcome to this webinar of EUD. The theme of this webinar is the quality of sign language interpretation in the audiovisual media. We want to share a few best practices with you. We will provide you information. We will go deeper into the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, presentations, and then a Q&A session at the end. This webinar will be recorded, and you'll be able to find it on the EUD webpage for you to view afterwards. The language of this webinar will be International Sign, and we will have spoken interpretation into English and subtitles in English. So you can both hear, read the webinar, and watch the subtitles. Also, there is a comment box where you can type your comments during the webinar. And also the transcripts of the webinar will be posted on the EUD website. So far from my introduction, we have 3 speakers today. And after their presentations, we'll have an opportunity for you to make comments or ask questions. If you have questions or want to make a comment, you can post a video and put it in the WhatsApp. You will see the number of the WhatsApp appearing on the bottom of the screen, plus 32 471 026 541. So you can post your WhatsApp video there. Alternatively, you can type your text in English and send it to us per WhatsApp. The topic of this webinar: the Audiovisual Media Service Directive. We will use the abbreviation AVMS from now on. The AVMS directive was adopted in 2018, and it's now up to the member states to translate this into national legislation. So the AVMS provides a European framework. Now all national governments have to adjust their audiovisual media service legislation or regulations. It covers TV broadcasts and online services. For example, services such as Amazon Video, Now TV, Netflix have to gradually increase the level of accessibility. So EU countries will have to improve and increase the accessibility of their audiovisual media. TV programs, national TV channels, broadcast channels, have to become accessible. Also, it has to be indicated in the program, in the TV schedule, which programs are accessible. Another aspect covers on-demand audiovisual services, VOD, video on demand services, where it's the viewer that decides when he or she wants to see the program. To illustrate this, for example, Netflix or HBO will be two services where the AVMS applies. The national governments have to guarantee that services like Netflix become gradually increasingly accessible. Also, sign language interpretation needs to be increasingly provided. But the AVMS itself does not clearly define the quality of sign language interpreter services that need to be made available, or the quantity of interpreter services that need to be made available. In that sense, the AVMS is not very specific. So now is the time where national governments are transposing the EU legislation into national legislation. So the EUD is approached frequently by people asking what national deaf associations can do. And there are currently no European-wide standards for interpretation in the audiovisual media. So the EUD board decided to organize this webinar to exchange thoughts, to have a discussion, and to provide you information. So deaf associations, sign language interpreter associations are welcome to watch this webinar and contribute their ideas and best practices. Also, it's good to start discussing guidelines on a national level and to see if AVMS standards, quality standards, can be developed. We have three expert speakers. First, Sanchez from Spain. We have Bojan Mod, an expert from Slovenia. And we have Maya Rit, sign language interpreter. All right. I wish you a very good webinar. I hope you enjoy our three presentations. And I will stop right here and pass the floor to David from Spain. David, you have the floor.
Hello, my name is David Sanchez, and I am representing the Center for Languages that is working under the Spanish government. And we focus on the provision of sign language on television and publications, but I'm going to be focusing on sign language interpretation and provisions of sign language interpretation within television. So because we need to look at accessibility for sign language interpreters, then we need to make sure that there are certain regulations, because we need to make sure, for example, that the sign language interpreter is not just a postage stamp within on the screen. So we have come together and created many guidelines on how to make sure we can provide accessible sign language interpretation. This was a long road. This didn't happen overnight, but we were able to come together and create these guidelines and create some best practices. I'd like to share these with you today. One best practice is we want to make sure that we just didn't do this under the scope of sign language interpreters. We made sure that we liaised with professionals, with television professionals, people that work in the field. Deaf Blind Association was also involved. Sign Language Interpreter Association was involved. The deaf community was involved. Broadcasters were involved. And we had a great focus group. And we came together to find out what was possible and what was not possible. We were able to put our needs, wishes on the table and come to compromises. This process wasn't easy, but this was a fundamental process. We would not be able to work together today without that process that we went through. And we learned so much from each other. There was so much information that we were able to glean from this as well. For example, providing sign language interpretation online is different than on television. So we needed to also make sure that there are certain technical specifications just in the more superficial parts of the matter, which is how you can see the interpreter on screen. However, there's much more to it. When you see a sign language interpreter on screen, if it's picture-in-picture, or if they're going to be standing next to each other, do you have the presenter and the interpreter at the same size? Do you have the sign language interpreter larger than the speaker? And we also need to look at who's going to provide the sign language interpreting. To be honest, we're not interested in if it's a hearing person or a deaf person. It's important that they both have the possibility. We also looked at three important aspects: the technical specifications. I'm not going to get into that today, but one technical aspect that's very, very important is that you have someone who can, it's like top sports interpreting. The interpreter needs to be able to keep up with the speed of broadcast news. It's a very different type of interpreting speed than other interpreting settings. Another important aspect is, of course, looking at the more aesthetics of the matter. Making sure that there are very clear guidelines on what the person will be wearing. If it is a children's program, you're not going to have someone in a suit, for example. So a dress and dress code is also just as important. The third thing that's important is basic requirements for the size of the interpreter. So we say having an interpreter in a 1/6 frame, which means if you split up the screen in 6 quadrants, that the interpreter is not less than 1/6 of the screen, but that would be a minimum, for example. So in 2003, we had some regulations that were put on paper that they said the interpreter should be at least 1/6 of the screen in size. However, we've noticed that the most difficult thing actually is the quality of interpretation. You can have all the technical specs in place. You can have the technical standards in place, but if you don't have a qualified interpreter, then it's not worth providing service. So we need to make sure that we provide quality professional interpreters that can interpret television. Once again, interpreters are used to interpreting perhaps live meetings and or conferences. However, the speed and the register of how someone talks on television or in a broadcast situation is very different. And so we need to make sure that there's an evaluation process to make sure that there are quality standards to have sign language interpreters working specifically for television. We noticed that it was quite difficult to evaluate interpreters, but we made sure that we came up with an evaluation process to where sign language interpreters can improve their interpreting for television. Once again, you need to make sure that you have someone that can be eloquent with their signing, that has experience interpreting broadcast type of information. We need to make sure that interpreters know their limits and they can tell the minute that, because when you look at a show and you see that an interpreter is flailing, you're going to turn off the show. You're not getting access to the information. So we do have this one reference from 2003. However, there is another, so HETV, it's broadcasting, streaming on the internet. So when we look at an interpreter, when I look at streamed television, they have an interpreter, but they're placed in many different ways. Or sometimes the hearing community will say the interpreter is disturbing or it's too much in view. So we've had to work with the broadcasters to make sure where that compromise can be, where we have access to the interpreter, but that there's specifications that are set. It's very important that the deaf community is involved. It's also important that we work together with the sign language interpreters. However, we also need to make sure that deaf people are always involved for the language control. Regardless of the sign language interpreter being deaf or hearing, we need to make sure that there is a deaf sign master, someone supporting the actual language output. In December, in Spain, we will actually be having a meeting looking at further regulations for providing sign language television, sign language interpreting on television. So we're really looking forward to taking that next step and finding out which regulations and specifications need to be put on paper and come up with standards for sign language interpretation happening live. There are also other sign language interpretations that are pre-recorded, and they also work differently. We also need to look at how many hours should an interpreter, or how long should an interpreter work at one point when you introduce a team interpreter and the like. Here in Spain, we do have sign language presented on television. And what we now have set up is that if people are interested in signing on stage, on TV, that they need to follow these guidelines. And one guideline that we have now added to this is basic standards that have been now approved. So that is a great step that we've achieved here in Spain, that we've been able to work together with the TV broadcast studios and organizations. We still need to look at the quality of interpretation. That is very difficult, and there needs some more work needs to be done to see how we can set guidelines on that as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, David, for a very clear presentation, which really is a great contribution to our discussion about how we can raise the quality of sign language interpretation. You went into the measurements, the minimum size of the interpreter on screen, the appropriate quality of the interpretation, and quality of the signing, the appearance of the interpreter. You manage new opportunities where the viewer has the potential to resize the interpreter. And you discussed the quality guidelines. So thank you for this positive experience, and thank you, David, for contributing to this discussion. We're going to move now to our second presenter, Bojan Mod from Slovenia. Bojan, you have the floor. Hello, Europe. Thank you for asking me to be a speaker at this yearly webinar. Makes me feel very proud. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Bojan. I have 20 years experience working for television and as a teacher, training deaf children in the media. I've been a teacher in a deaf school. And for the past 5 years, I've been working as a private TV channel. So it's not part of the national Slovenian TV, but I have been working for the past 5 years as a deaf presenter for a private TV channel. So far from my experience. I've been doing some research in how we can have quality criteria for sign language interpreters. We don't have them. Once an interpreter is certified, does that mean that that interpreter is able to work on TV immediately? My answer is no. Because it's very different from interpreting in a real life setting versus interpreting on screen. Because on screen, topics are discussed in very short times of 2 or 3 minutes maximum. In order to come up with a proper interpretation, you need training. You need to know the techniques. You need to know the strategies of how to pass on the information in the short time frame we have. In order for that translation to be proper, you need to practice. This is of utmost importance. Also, as you know, educational levels vary greatly within the deaf community. There are those deaf people who have a good mastery of the written language, they like to see more subtitles. Other deaf people like to see the information presented in very clear signing. And when I look around Europe, I see that there are some problems, especially if there's no deaf people involved in the team. There should be deaf consultants or deaf presenters that can contribute a deaf cultural taste to the interpretation. I really have a great preference for having deaf interpreters involved in the team that provides TV interpretation. When we look at national TV channels or private TV channels, it's best that if the interpreter already finishes a translation, practices before the actual broadcast happens, so the deaf interpreter can memorize the text more or less. That would be that's one suggestion that could increase the quality of interpretation. The second aspect of quality is the technology. In the early days, interpreters were put in a small bubble in the corner of the screen. The bubble was so small that you couldn't see the interpreter or the interpretation properly. Sometimes we had excellent interpreters, but the background made it impossible to watch the interpretation clearly. For example, deaf-blind people or deaf people with visual impairments, it's very important to have the right color contrast between the appearance of the interpreter and the backdrop. So I suggest that the EUD establishes a working group to develop a minimum standard for maybe the minimum size of the interpreter on screen, and perhaps this standard for accessible TV, accessible for deaf people that is, could be developed by the EUD. Because I think governments would find it very useful to have such European minimum standards. Also, the EUD, I suggest, should get in touch with the EBU, the European Broadcast Union, which is a network of national TV channels. And it's important that also the EBU gets involved and supports this minimum standard. Because what I often see is that deaf people go to conferences, get very inspired, go back home, and they bump into resistance from either national regulators or TV channels. In terms of the training for interpreters, I'd like to discuss two themes. Firstly, if you have a team of interpreters who work on a rotating basis, that does not increase the quality. Because it's important that interpreters who work for TV, who do news programs, keep up with the news in the world, keep up with what's happening in the world. They read the newspapers, they have to be aware of what issues are current in the world. So this background knowledge and this knowledge of the world is very important as well. When discussing the budget, it's important not only to discuss how many hours will be interpreted, but also who can be the interpreters and how these interpreters should be selected. So, like I said before, I suggest that the EUD looks at the AVMS again. So 30% of the countries need to be 30% of the broadcasts need to be European created. I suggest that the EUD lobbies for a minimum of 20% of all programs to be presented or interpreted into sign language. There are some countries that legislate for 100% subtitles. I would like to see on top of that at least 20% of all programs to be presented or interpreted in sign language. It's also vitally important that both deaf and hearing interpreters are involved in TV interpreting teams. So far, my presentation. If you want to contact me, you can contact my organization. Also, you can have a view on the World Federation of the Deaf last Congress in Paris, where my presentation I gave. Great. Thank you, Bojan, for your presentation. Thank you. A few highlights that stuck out for me, like David's presentation. You also emphasized the importance of having the right interpreter for the TV. An interpreter that is able to make culturally appropriate translation. You also discussed the minimum size of the interpreter on screen, and that you emphasize the need to establish minimum standards for the sizing of interpreters on screen. You also suggested the EUD to establish a working group to work with the EBU as a channel to provide minimum standards. You also suggested a minimum amount of programs to be interpreted. And like David, Bojan, you emphasized the need for deaf interpreters to be involved in the team that manages the interpreted programs. Thank you, Bojan. And now we've come to our third speaker of today, Maya de Wit. Maya, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, EUD, for inviting me to present today. And hello to all our viewers today. Looking at sign language interpretation within the TV industry is extremely important. We have seen, of course, especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic, that sign language interpretation on television is more visible. Vilnius County Sign Language Interpreters Center in Lithuania asked me to organize a training on looking at sign language interpretation within television. So I took that on. This happened exactly 1 year ago in London, and we had sign language interpreters, students, different guest presenters, experts that came all together to look at and share best practices of providing quality sign language interpretation. So I'm going to share that with you today. And also since the year 2000, I've been looking at the status of sign language interpreters in Europe. So that is what I would also like to share with you today. This I have actually looked at every 4 years. And so with these two great amounts of data that I have, I'd like to share a few highlights. When looking at sign language interpretation on television, indeed, we have looked at the case of where the sign language interpreter is provided next to the presenter or maybe in the corner of the TV screen. And regardless of how it was presented, everyone has been saying, oh, this is fantastic that there's sign language interpretation provided, and that they would then also provide an interpreter just to check off the box. However, it was more like tokenism. They just were providing a sign language interpreter, but it wasn't really accessible. And the responsibility of representing the sign language interpretation and that role is also very important. So we need to look at that providing a sign language interpreter is more than just having the interpretation visible, but it comes with a lot more with that. So I was looking at how can we ensure that quality. It's been said previously that, of course, there's the technical aspects. It's important to know where the interpretation is being provided. Is it on site, in the studio, or are they providing it at home? What type of technical support is provided? You see quite a variation of literally the size of the interpreter. There is no standard out there whatsoever. Secondly, we also need to, in conjunction, look at the quality of interpretation. There are no trainings out there for sign language interpreters to train and improve their skills and provide an adequate interpretation for broadcast level sign language interpreting. We need to make sure that there are possibilities to be evaluated and that the deaf and hearing community are doing this together. We need to look at the language that's being produced, the sign language quality that's being produced, and that is at par with the spoken language that is being produced during that broadcast. Like Bojan Mod said, it's also very important to have preparation ahead of time. You cannot wake up and automatically go on television and interpret the news. You need to prepare yourself. You need to read what's happening. You need to be aware of the everyday affairs. So because I am providing this very intensive role, you need to also look at remuneration. You need to make sure that you are being paid an appropriate rate for all of this work that you're doing, for both the preparation, for taking on the responsibility of providing this quality level interpretation and doing the actual work. We also need to look at which interpreters will we ask to provide this interpretation. Can you just choose any interpreter, or do they need to go through a certain process? Do we need to make sure that there are certain minimal standards that the interpreter themselves, the quality they need to have to provide a good interpretation? So 1 year ago, we had a conference in London, and we looked at these challenges together. One issue that came up was training. There are some bachelor sign language interpreter trainings and master trainings, but there's no specific training for providing sign language interpretation for television or different broadcasts. And you also need to make sure that you have different interpreters for different genres. You have formal interpretation for the news, and you also have different interpretations for possibly children's programs. So we also need to look at having the right interpreter for the right situation. It's also important that the sign language interpreter realizes that they are a role model for the signs that they are providing, because the signs that they choose to use on television will be then further used from the audience. So they need to take on that responsibility of which signs they use. It's also important that we produce some guidelines. We need to have media guidelines, sign language interpretation guidelines, and training guidelines. But we need to think of, do we do this in unison, or do we do this in separate sectors? And we have to look at which type of experts we need to make sure that there is quality in each of these, for each of these factors. If there's a training that will be set up, we need to make sure that it's high quality training, that the right professionals are involved, so that when the sign language interpreter has followed this training, that they can provide their interpretation with confidence. It's also very important that we join forces together and lobby for good access and sign language interpretation at a higher level. And we need to make sure that the deaf and hearing community work in unison, they work together. I am a researcher and an interpreter. I'm very interested in finding out what is out there, but I think it's important that we have evidence-based information to create these standards. Because I'm a researcher at heart, I believe that this should be well supported before we just go ahead and set up guidelines. There are some resources that I think we could look at. Like I said, there is a video with a compilation of all of the videos of interpreting on TV, and that is on mayadevit.nl and looking at Seminar 2019. There's also an article that's been written on the London seminar, but that will be published actually in the coming weeks. And then I also have some recommended research by Marta Bosch Baliarda, where they looked at the specific sizing of what is the best size to have for a sign language interpretation. That has been very well sought out and put on paper in a nice formal way. And lastly, there's WFD position paper on accessible information in sign language during the COVID-19. That's also being updated. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to working together.
Thank you, Maya, for an excellent, very clear presentation. A few highlights for me were the following points. You stressed the importance of the representation of an interpreter who represents the deaf community in a way. So the interpreter needs to be aware of this aspect of his or her work. Also, you need to be aware of the fact that you are part of the expansion of the vocabulary for the deaf viewers. Also, stress the importance of working in a team before actually going on screen. You stress the importance of preparation, proper remuneration of the interpreter, and you questioned who is or should be the one recruiting interpreters. And you emphasize the need for specific training for interpreting on TV. This is not just part of any basic interpreter training. You also mentioned the importance of guidelines. And you questioned if there should be specific guidelines for interpreters working on TV or video. Thank you. Thank you again, all three presenters, Bojan, David, and Maya. And we need to move to the next part of our webinar, our Q&A session. At the bottom of your screen, you can see our WhatsApp number. If you have a question for any of the three speakers, you can either post a video in sign language on the WhatsApp group to the number you see below in international sign, or you can type your question in English and send it to the same number. So I think we can take the first question. Are there any public documents or resources for interpreting standards on TV that we can use as a point of reference? Okay, who of the three presenters? David, Bojan, Maya?
So here in Spain, we have one best practices document from our center, and that has been produced with the government. And first we show them our recommendations, and then they had to approve it. This has been successful. However, it has not been taken up legally. We have best practices that we've shared with them, but we still need to make this legal. So that there is a difference. We need to make sure of that.
Thank you, David. Bojan, Maya, would you like to add something? Maya first, then Bojan.
Yes, just what David had said, that there are guidelines, that best advice, but then it's important that we have formal agreements that need to be shared. But we need to begin with the guidelines about the process and what's possible. We need to come up with best practices, and once we have those best practices, we can then formalize those and make sure that that becomes a formal standard. But I think the first needs to happen before the next. I believe some smaller countries as well are asking for help. They don't have the resources. So I think it would be great indeed to be able to share these best practices within Europe and have a European standard.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If every country thinks up their own standards, yeah, that's, of course, it would be better to do it on a European level.
Thank you, Maya. Bojan? EU legislation is one thing. If national governments transpose this international regulations or legislation, that's a different process. It's on a national level where often the deaf associations are not asked, or deaf associations themselves are not aware of what they can do. So it would be helpful for national deaf associations if the EUD could help provide minimum standards for the technology, to have an agenda. So all national deaf associations can work with the same EUD provided guidelines. But you know, in many EU countries, there is no cultural background, cultural knowledge available of how to make TV accessible. And it's important that deaf people are involved in creation of national guidelines. And therefore, it would be important for an EUD to establish a working group to look into this. Marco, wow, you all three came up with very clear suggestions. And you suggest, and I like the idea, that EUD establish an expert group to collect best practices and to suggest guidelines. David also mentioned the fact that there is an importance to not just follow the legislative track, but you also need to look at practical suggestions and practical suggestions for broadcast channels to work. Next question, what about the role of deaf interpreters in TV? Interesting and a very important question. All three of you are presenters know that deaf interpreters are coming up as equal partners to hearing interpreters. Bojan? Yes, I have the experience that if you have involved deaf interpreters on TV, deaf community reports that they have a better understanding, because the interpreters have just a different, let's say, flavor to them. They're more culturally appropriate translations, and for hearing interpreters, they need more training to develop that nuance and that finesse. David?
In Spain, the situation is a little bit different. Until now, the sign language interpreting training has not come to the deaf community. That is different in other parts of Europe, and we'd like to change this. But until now, we've had only hearing sign language interpreters on television. At the university, we are now looking at also training deaf interpreters. So we hope to change the situation. We do know that because the deaf interpreters also need to be trained, we want to make sure that we don't just put a deaf person on television because they're deaf. We want to make sure that they're trained first. But we're working on that, and we hope that that will be able to be more available.
Thank you. Maya?
I think the important question is quality. It's a pity to look at deaf or hearing. I think we should just look at the quality of interpretation, full stop, to make sure that the quality is there, that they've indeed been trained, and that they work in a team, that they can work in a team well, is just as important. I don't think we need to use the label of a deaf interpreter over hearing interpreter. I see that discussion more and more, and I completely respect that native signers, there's nothing can beat that. However, I think we need to also look at the quality of interpreting. And I think the goal is that we look at the output, but also to be able to work in a team together, to be able to do the appropriate preparation, and who ends up actually producing that. I think the team then also decides who the best person for that is.
Thank you. Bojan, just adding to that, I agree. I would like to see deaf and hearing interpreters work together. Yes. But I think there are countries where deaf interpreters are accepted as equal partners, and there are also countries where they're not. And in those countries, it's hearing interpreters who get the benefits, who get the paid jobs, get the employment opportunities. So I think it's very important that deaf professionals in those countries also get a chance to be employed on screen. So therefore, I keep emphasizing the need to involve deaf people as members of the interpreting team. Marco, I think you all three agree on that. I have nothing to add to that. Thank you. The third question. To promote more employment of deaf sign language users, should there be a memo of understanding that only deaf people should be employed for post-production broadcasts, so not the live broadcasts? Thank you. This is a very special question, really a follow-up to the last question. So pre-recorded videos, who should interpret those? What is your opinion? I'm looking at the three speakers. Who would like to go first? So pre-recorded videos, the person who asked the question is saying, should be only interpreted by deaf interpreters. Bojan. Maybe in the future, we'll see more pre-recorded videos or programs. And again, I'd be happy to have them interpreted by either deaf or hearing interpreters. David?
Pre-recorded interpretations is easier. Live is the most difficult because of the tempo. With a pre-recorded interpretation, you can re-record it. However, pre-recorded takes more time. And often the budget is actually quite low. So you usually need to do a lot of work in a small amount of time and on a low budget. I think deaf people can work in either situation, but we also do need to make sure that the standards with it are at par. I definitely think, once again, it depends on their style, it depends on what the interpreter can produce, so both hearing or deaf.
Maya, would you like to add something? No, like I said before, it's the language that matters at the end. And it makes a difference if you're working from a text live or if you work from a script that you can prepare. How much opportunity do you have to prepare the translation? The quality of the translation, the quality of the delivery. I think that's the point, to optimize that quality. Marco, thank you. I agree. I'd like to add something. There is a difference between interpretation and the translation, and the processes are different. So in a team, you might have interpreters and translators. They're different skills, and those skills need to be distinguished. This is something maybe we can discuss later, but this is definitely a topic also for the expert group that the EUD might establish, could discuss. David?
Yes, within our work, we have pre-recorded translations that we produce. And 1 hour, we have about 1,000 pre-recorded translations that we have produced. Hearing people did the translation, hearing interpreters. But it takes a lot of time because first you need to look at the source material, then you discuss how you want the interpretation to be, then you film it. So there's a lot of steps to make sure you have a high quality translation. So I think it's important that people realize what is involved when producing a translation that's pre-recorded in comparison with providing a live translation.
Thank you. And perhaps we can look at L1 or L2 users. And it doesn't matter if you're an L1 or L2 user. You need specific skills. I see questions are keeping coming in. So let's go to them a bit quickly and let's see how far we get time-wise. The next question, please. What about the background color for deaf-blind people or deaf people with visual difficulties? Great. A very important aspect of accessibility of the information. David?
Yes, indeed. This is very important. It's also very important to work with the deaf-blind associations and do this in tandem with them. But you have to realize that the needs for deaf-blind vary greatly per person. It is quite individual. So you can't have, it's not one standard that fits all. It's very unique and individual. However, there's a spectrum, but you can come to a middle ground of what works for the highest group of deaf-blind people. It's been difficult to look at that, but so for example, that's what I've tried to do now as well, is just to make sure that it's by contrast.
Good, and it's again important to have minimum standards. For example, I'm not sure if my colored background is appropriate now. I hope there's enough contrast between the color of my hands and my backdrop for deaf-blind people. I think many people like dark blue as an outfit. Bojan? Accessibility of TV programs involves more than just bringing in a body, an interpreter. You need to look at the lighting, you need to look at the contrast, you need to look at the background. We need to have minimum standards. For example, if you drive anywhere in Europe, there's a standard for traffic lights. You know, when it's red, you need to stop. When it's green, you can go. Mark was saying, I like your sign for standard. I think an international sign, we could start adopting this into the international sign vocabulary. Maya? Maya, did you want to add something?
I just prove what I said. I can shortly intervene in regards to the specs for the size of the interpreter. If we look at a deaf-blind necessities, is you have to make sure that the background indeed, but the working interpreter, what I notice is the framing of the interpreter, so that there's a black frame on the interpreter's frame, so that the deaf-blind person can find the interpreter box more clearly. Often, the frame of the interpreter is actually disappears within the greater frame. So the picture-in-picture should be highlighted. And so I actually just found out that they would appreciate if the interpreter frame would be then framed in a black box, for example, or a black frame.
Thank you, Maya. So we see really these guidelines will not be simple to develop. There are technical aspects, biological aspects, like how does the human eye work and what works best for the eyes of the viewer. Can I ask the viewers to please stop posting questions? We have many questions lined up and want to go through as many of them as possible. We have about half an hour left. All right? So you can stop posting comments or questions. Also, after this webinar, you can always contact the EUD by the number you see at the bottom or through our website. You can see at the bottom now. You can always reach us afterwards. All right, are you ready for the next question? Let's go. Let's see, we have more challenging questions. Will you provide more information about the meeting in Madrid that David Sanchez mentioned? Got it?
Yes, sure, I can. So you can look at our website. So the website is, yeah, it's Spanish, however. It's not in English, unfortunately. It's only in Spanish. But what we want to do is you have CNLE, practice CNLE, and then TV. If you Google that, then you'll find the information about the conference. And if you would like to attend the conference, you're more than welcome.
Thank you, David. David, can you post your the exact address of the website in the comment box or in the chat box? That'd be a great resource. Maya?
Oh, in regards to resources, there will be an article coming up in regards to the London conference. So there will be a summary article on what was, so best practice that came out of that conference. And that will be published shortly, I believe. And it's about 4 or 5 pages. So I will share that resource with you as well.
Perfect. Okay, we're stressed for time. Next question. If a deaf interpreter interprets during a live TV broadcast without a script beforehand, how would that work? Interesting question. Live interpretation without a script. Bojan. It's possible. If I interpret live, I work with a hearing feed interpreter. I'm on camera. I have a hearing interpreter who signs from the spoken language in more or less sign-supported language, and the deaf interpreter takes the feed and translates it into proper sign language. And this will take about 4 to 7 seconds between the source message and the target message. Otherwise, live interpretation is not possible, I think, so you need to take into account a delay of 4 to 7 seconds. Marco, thank you. Any additions, David, Maya?
Exactly what he said. It's just good to mention, indeed, that there's a slight delay.
David?
It's also possible to work with an auto cue. That's another possibility. There are deaf interpreters that work with an auto cue and provide an interpretation, or you can work with a feed. It just depends on what the deaf interpreter is used to working with. So both is possible.
Bojan, yes, that's possible to work with an auto cue. However, live TV very often is live, and it is often not recorded with an auto cue. If you go to a reporter in the field who does an interview, then there's no auto cue available. So for that aspect, you can run into trouble.
Good point.
Marco, okay, let me see if my interpreter's caught up. Then, if yes, move to the next question. Our national TV offers many broadcasts with sign language interpretation, but only on the internet platform. Does that mean it respects the accessibility standard? I saw Maya shaking her head. Maya?
No, indeed, I don't agree. I work together with WFD, the World Federation of the Deaf, and we actually looked at, we had a position paper on this, and indeed we saw, as I said earlier in my presentation, there are many situations where they just check the box. It's tokenism. And so what they do is, oh, well, we're not going to put it on national television on the broadcast. We're just going to provide the interpretation, the accessibility online, out of sight, out of view. But this is not fully accessible. Accessible means that you are on the live channels. Also on Twitter, this was very, very, I was very vocal about this.
Thank you. Bojan. The AVMS mentions that it's important that national television channels, live shows, need to be accessible for deaf people. And the internet could be an additional option, but that's it. David?
If I could add, there is, interpretation provided on the internet and also on television. But it's also, you have to look at when it's being provided in the middle of the night, not during prime time. We need to make sure that the sign language interpretation accessibility is provided during prime time hours, and not only when people are sleeping. People say, oh yeah, we provide sign language interpretation. Look and come on to television at 11 o'clock at night, and everyone is sleeping. So you need to make sure that, and they also say you need to have a minimum of 10 hours a day. So they provide it from 11 at night till 11 in the morning, or 9 in the morning. That's not actual provisions and meeting the standards for accessibility.
Thank you. Good points. That internet should not be the only option, but at best an additional option. For example, if there's a storm happening right now, a hurricane happening now, you can't wait for the next day for the for that news to be interpreted. Especially in emergency situations, you need to have live interpretation. Next question, please. Hello, my name is Johan. I'm from the Philippines. In terms of guidelines, I think it will be important to have international guidelines for interpreters on television. For example, about the sizing, the frame of the interpreter. And we are currently lobbying our government to approve the rules and minimum standards for interpreters on TV. So I think it's important to have international global standard. That would also help us in the Philippines. Thank you very much. Good point. Surprise, we have a viewer from all the way around the world, from the Philippines. Thank you for a wonderful comment, question. And the idea has become global now. Is there any one of you who would like to respond? Bojan first, then Maya. Like I said before, we need standards, yes. Maybe if we develop an EU standard, maybe they're useful for the Philippines too. And maybe one day we'll have an opportunity to develop a global standard. Possibility. I think you both agree, right?
Yeah, just like I said before, Maya said.
Right. So guidelines are needed on the EU level and perhaps also WFD level. Of course, we work with the World Federation of the Deaf. And of course, we should also work with WASLI, EFSLI. This joint work is important. Okay, I think we can move to the next question. Do deaf associations use the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? For example, Article 4.1F, Article 9, Article 21D, to require the accessibility of audiovisual media? Do deaf associations use the CRPD? That's a very good question. Yeah, we've been discussing the AVMS, but it's not our only legal instrument we have. We have also 3 relevant articles in the CRPD. Any one of you would like to respond to that? David.
For media regulations, we've been working with CLC.com, and so there are also many recommendations and standards there, but I think that we need to bring these all together. I have looked at the articles in UNCRPD, and so we've put them all together. So not only looking at the UNCRPD, but also looking at what's online and also the AVMS. But there's not much when you put it all together. And once you bring it to and lobby, they make many changes to the standards that we propose. But I think if we do this on a European level, that we would stand much stronger.
Thank you, Bojan. Maya? Maya.
Yeah, if I can add, yes, we do need to lobby, and we have the UNCRPD, but many governments, they don't really take it seriously. I mean, here in the Netherlands, what's really made a change is, yes, we provided a sign language interpreter, but the way that happened is that a deaf person was really frustrated that they didn't have sign language interpretation. So what they did is they actually made a sign, and during the actual broadcast, they stood behind the broadcast and they were on national news and said, can you please provide sign language interpretation? And that's how we ended up getting sign language interpretation provided, not through the different instruments and lobbying.
Thank you. Bojan, you don't seem very happy, but you have nothing to add. Okay. Yes, the CRPD is very important.
Definitely.
It provides a framework. Governments that have ratified the CRPD have an obligation to implement it, as well as implement the ABMS. All right, the interpreter's done talking. Next question, please. Is the international obligation of states an effective argument in practice? Whoa, wait. Could we have the question again? Is the international obligation of a state an effective argument in practice? Aha. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the interpretation of the question. Is the question clear? Looking at the three speakers? David is saying no. Bojan, no. All right, let me try to rephrase it. We have the CRPD. So governments have an obligation under the CRPD, but they have to implement it on a practical level in everyday life. So telling your government that they have a responsibility, is that strong enough an argument?
That's indeed the issue. We have these international obligations, but it's literally frozen text. They don't know how to then implement that on a practical level. And I think that's where we need guidelines to support the international obligations, to lead them through step by step, both the technical specifications and quality specifications. I think you need the guidelines for the practical application.
I agree. We need guidelines to show different governments good examples and good ways of implementing the international obligations. We need international standards that can be used on a national level so people do not have to reinvent the wheel. And indeed, this webinar, this exchange of information we're having now is a way to collect best practices that may help develop the guidelines. So this is a really good discussion in international sign. Isn't it a wonderful communication tool? Next question, please. Good quality interpreters, high technology, and having the right training were mentioned. But what about salary conditions? The best interpreters do not want to work on media because of the low salary. Perfect. I think it was mentioned by several speakers, the topic of remuneration, salaries for interpreters. Does any one of you want to comment? David.
Well, one thing that I can add to the conversation is it also comes down to respecting the work of an interpreter. What we see from the government's point of view is they are not paid equally to their services because they don't see the quality and the value of their work. If you look at how much sign language interpreters ask for conferences, it's much higher than what sign language interpreters are paid on television. How to do it? I don't have a response for that. We need to indeed lobby together and I believe look at the accessibility. And once we have more given, and that is more legally recognized, I think we can then require and demand more rights and a higher salary. But it's not legally recognized, so that's the issue.
Thank you, David. Bojan? It's not a matter of budget. It's not a matter of lack of funding. If you see ads, hearing TV presenters, they are selected carefully, they're paid well. Professional camera people are trained well, are paid well. And would sign language interpreters be paid on a sub-professional level? That's not right. Accessibility is equally important, needs to be equally respected. There's no question. It should not be a budgetary question. As an example, now during the Corona crisis, we see an increased number of interpreters on TV. Almost all the news broadcasts on Corona are interpreted now. So this theme of accessibility of TV programs, I think the Corona crisis provides a good opportunity, and we have to make sure that after the Corona crisis is over, that the inclusion of interpreters is not diminished.
Sorry, Maya, wait. There has been some research done, and unfortunately what happens is the interpreters that are working for these specialized areas, be it legal or interpretation, they do it out of passion for the work and because they're specialized in it. However, they've spent more time to specialize, and it's actually an oxymoron that they spend more time becoming a specialist in their field and they get paid less. We see this in other areas as well.
Thank you. Very briefly, David.
I just quickly wanted to add the interpreters that we see online, they will sometimes price compare as well. They will ask for different bids and they will choose the lowest bid, and that's also an issue. So we need to make sure that within the community but they're also not allowed to price fix as well. So it's hard to figure out how to do that.
Again, you emphasize the importance of having minimum standards, high level minimum standards. Very clear, thank you. For the three speakers, we are moving to our last question. There's a small number of native language role models on TV in the form of native signers. Should we advocate that all children programs on TV must be interpreted by a deaf interpreter? Interesting question. Deaf interpreters for children specifically. Any comments? I see puzzled faces. But Bojan. For children programs, yes, it will be important to have TV programs are important for deaf children, right? It provides them information, it prepares them for life. The interpretation needs to be provided for children's shows. I think it's important, and it could be a deaf interpreter. David.
In the past, media, there was not much media and internet for children, and now it's all over the place. They are selfies, mobile phones. Children are exposed to much more media in their daily lives. Many children actually sign really well at a much younger age if I compare to me, and that's because they have so much access to media and sign language on media. So I believe that, and they learn so quickly, they're sponges. So I believe that's definitely a place where they are learning language. So if there's a TV program, and this is pre-recorded, and they see it in sign language, what I think is best is that the presenter is doing it in sign language so that it's not interpreted. Then they will be more involved, I think, and it'll make them feel more at ease.
Maya?
I think a great idea is having children sign in a children's program. I think for the deaf viewers, deaf children would love to see deaf children, their peers. They always see adults, but I think it would also be an idea to have deaf child presenters.
I like it. And again, it's the difference between watching a signed show that's presented in sign language versus an interpreted show. It's very different. Also, it would be important to be a child and be able to see other children signing as role models. These are all important aspects of language development. Yeah. So for children, let's say age 6 sign differently than children age 15. So it's important to have all these ages role modeled as well. Bojan. We see that increasingly the deaf community in a way is shrinking because of cochlear implants, mainstreaming, etc. So it's so important that children have access. They are exposed to the hearing culture continuously, but how are their children exposed to deaf culture? So perhaps we should phrase the question that way and really support deaf cultural presence on TV to be increased. Marco, you're right. We all have a responsibility to also keep our language alive and to keep our language vital. And TV could be a tool for that. The AVMS could be, pre-recorded videos could be, increased visibility of sign language will increase the motivation of people to learn sign language and increase the visibility and vitality of our language. We have, unfortunately, no more time for questions, but I want to really thank our 3 speakers for your presentation, your comments, for the good examples. And how can we ensure that the AVMS leads to real-life accessibility through sign language interpretation? And quality of sign language interpretation and translation is extremely important. And we need to work together to provide guidelines for both live TV and pre-recorded programs. We need to knock on the doors of regulators. We need to knock on the door of broadcast channels, and we need training. Also, we discussed that it's not a matter of having either hearing or deaf interpreters, but a matter of cooperation between deaf and hearing interpreters on the ground, but also between deaf and interpreter associations on the political level, on the European level, national level. So there's a lot of work ahead of us. But I think this webinar has contributed and has been very inspiring. I'm looking at the 3 speakers. Is there any final comment you'd like to make? The EUDY. No. Oh, please also look at the EUDY website. They also have a webinar. Please take a look at that. Thank you. Thank you all.